All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Creating a SQL Database and SQL Server on the Azure portal. Thanks again for joining us. I am your host, Joseph Cascasan. If you read about me on the bio, that's great. But if not, I'd like to take this time to quickly introduce myself. I've been working in the IT training industry for over 8 years now. A lot of experience helping clients in the public and private sector, helping them meet their IT training needs in cybersecurity, desktop support, systems, networking, storage, etc. And I've been with QuickStart for about a year now, a little over a year now, I think, and I'm serving Northern California enterprise clients. With that said, I'd like to quickly move on to the real star of this show, which is my colleague and presenter of this webinar, Jeff Rathjen. Jeff, are you ready?
Yeah, I am. How are you doing, Joseph?
I'm good. A really quick fun fact, last time that I hung out with Jeff, Jeff and I were in Massachusetts eating a Wally burger. Isn't that right, Jeff?
That's right. I'd never been to Wally Burger before. That was great.
So go ahead, Jeff, and go ahead and introduce yourself and let the audience know your background and whatnot.
Sure. So, thanks for coming to this seminar. It's exciting. I'm really excited about Azure as a portal and as a hosting service, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'll keep this one real quick. I have the privilege to have been one of the very first Microsoft certified people in the world, and I was one of the very first MCTs, Microsoft certified trainers in the world. That was back when we were teaching OS2 and LAN Manager. That's all that just means is I'm old, been around a while. I've been working with SQL Server ever since it became a product back in the late 80s. I think it was 88, if I remember right, with the very version 1.0. And trust me, if you work with SQL Server, you're glad you didn't work with those back then. They were a mess. They've gotten a lot better. I've worked as both a DBA and a developer, and also as a BI developer. So I've kind of done the gamut in SQL Server. I'm a leather worker. That always sounds weird. I told the guy a while ago that I was really into leather, and boy, that sparked an interesting conversation. What I mean is I like to make things out of leather, and I tool it and do that as kind of a side hobby of mine. I'm also a huge Chicago Cubs fan. So this is an exciting time to be a Cubs fan. Most of my life, that was an embarrassing thing to say. I'm also owned by a German short-haired dog named Bishop, and I introduce him because there's a very good chance he'll make himself known at some point, because his prime function in life is to bark at anything that walks by on the sidewalk. So if you hear Bishop, then just know that's what he's doing. I also blog at the recalcitrantdba.blogspot.com. If you want to go over there and check that out, that would be great. All right, so here's what we're going to do over the next hour. At least I hope we can get this done in an hour. I'm going to talk about the difference between a SQL database and a SQL Server as it relates to Azure. Obviously, everybody will know the difference between them in an on-premise or local situation, but how do they differ when you put them into Azure? We'll talk about that. Also going to look at the limitations. So what can you and can't you do with a SQL database compared to an installed SQL Server? Then we'll talk about how on-premise, or in other words, locally hosted objects and Azure-based objects, cloud-based objects, differ in just general terms. All of that discussion is going to be fairly quick. My main goal here is to demonstrate this and show you how to create and manage both SQL databases and SQL Server instances in the cloud. So with that said, let's get started. Oh, I should say, by the way, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. I won't be able to hear you, but if you type them into the chat window, then Joseph is going to pick those up. And then when I come to a good breaking point, he'll interrupt me and ask those. And I'd like to get to all of them. If I don't get to all your questions, I will invite you to just send them to Joseph. He should be putting it, if he hasn't already, he should put his email address in the chat window.
I'm putting it in right now.
Perfect.
And yeah, and also if you want to stay anonymous and do not want to ask your question on this chat, you could always just email me and I could go ahead and ask it for you.
Yeah. Another really good way to get information is through a system that we at QuickStart are pretty proud of called Expert Connect. And we can send, if you're interested, we can send you information. You don't have to have taken a class from us to participate in that. It's a really great forum. It's more than just a forum. It's a place for downloading resources and looking at articles. And we also have some curated library content on not just SQL Server, but all sorts of different topics. So Expert Connect is a great way to get these questions answered too if you don't want to do either of the other options. All right. So the difference between a SQL database and a SQL Server in the context of an Azure installation. So when we talk about an Azure SQL database, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's just a database. It's hosted in Azure. You create it and you host it in Azure. You don't have a server that you deal with. Now, obviously there's a server there, but you don't configure it. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to deal with it. It's just a standalone database, basically. So there are both pros and cons to this. Two of the really good things is your server configuration is limited. In fact, it's almost non-existent. As you'll see in the demos, there are some things you configure about it. But as you think about hosting a SQL Server database on your own machine, if your work is a DBA, you know the constant upkeep, constant tuning, constant worrying about this and that, and high availability, backups, restores, all that kind of stuff. It's done. It's all taken care of for you. So that's both a good thing and a bad thing, depending on how you're wound. It also, and this is fairly recent with the advent of SQL 2017 and not quite that early, but after that, has two properties that are yet to be proven to me, but are kind of exciting. One is auto-tuning, and the other is index management. Auto-tuning and index management are processes by which the server, now mind you don't deal with the server, but the server does this work, takes a look at your queries and creates auto-tuning in the procedure cache and the plan cache. And it looks like it's going to be exciting. To be perfectly honest with you, there have been auto-tuning efforts in the past. I remember SQL 7 had one. I can't remember back far enough, but there have been several times when Microsoft has tried to do auto-tuning types of things. In fact, I was reading an article just a couple of weeks ago, and it was all excited about how they're going to do auto-tuning and DBAs won't even be needed anymore. And I had to laugh because it was an article from like the mid-90s. So they've been trying to do that for a long time, but this time I think they've got a better shot at getting it done. And then also with a SQL database hosted in Azure, there's index management. All of the routine things you have to worry about. Keeping your indexes rebuilt or reorganized for defragmenting, autofill, fill factor. All of those kinds of things are taken care of for you. And again, I'm holding off judgment. I'm hoping these work as well as they sound like they're going to, but I haven't had a lot of opportunity to play with those in a real live, decent sized production environment. I'll let you know when I find out. As opposed to a SQL database in Azure, you can create a SQL Server in Azure. What that really boils down to is you in Azure, you create a virtual machine that will be running Windows or Linux, your choice, in that virtual machine, and then SQL Server running on top of that. In other words, it's just exactly like if you were running a virtual machine on your own premises, on your machine. You can, when you do this, you can start from scratch with a virtual machine with nothing in it, install your operating system, install SQL Server, do all of that kind of thing. Or, as I'll show you when we get into it, you can choose a pre-configured install. So you can say, I want to run SQL Server 2017 on a Windows 2016 server or on a Linux distribution. You can just choose it, and it's just a simple click, and you're done. The big advantage of SQL Server installation is in a virtual machine is that you have full control of everything SQL. You can do anything you want. It's just like it was on-premise, it's just further away from you physically. It's up in a cloud somewhere. So that's the basic difference. Now there is a third thing coming, and that's called a managed instance, and it's just right on the cuff. I thought seriously about diving into that in here, but two things stopped me. One is just time. We have a limited amount of time, and the second thing is simply that it hasn't proven itself to me yet. It's just out in preview now, and I'm not sure that I'm ready to tell anybody that they should check it out yet. It may be great, don't get me wrong. I just haven't developed any confidence in it yet. I'm thinking it'll be good though. So the limitations of an Azure SQL database. So not a SQL Server installation, but just a pure Azure SQL database. And by the way, I've listed down here a website that gives you the full list of limitations. And I'm not going to go through all of them by any means, but you can have this, you can have my PowerPoint slides, and you can have this link. And that documents is a full-blown documentation on the limitations, what you do and don't get with an Azure SQL database. But the high points, the important ones to me. First of all, backups and restores. Backups, there's a really great story and a really bad story about this. And they both revolve around the fact that you cannot do backups for an Azure SQL database, period. The good part to that is Microsoft takes care of that for you, and they back up, and then they're able to restore to a point in time. So you can restore to any point in time within the last 24 hours, and depending upon the plan you buy, you can go back further, any point in time for a week or for a month or whatever it is your plan gives you. Obviously, the longer back you go, the more money you're going to pay. But they're able to restore to a point in time. But my question is, and I asked this of all my students who are taking DBA classes from me, I asked them and I asked you to think about the last time you restored anything, database, file server, anything at all, and ask yourself, why did I have to do that? Was it because of a hardware failure? Or was it because somebody did something stupid? Somebody dropped a table or deleted a DLL or whatever. And I find that while hardware failure does account for some of it, the vast majority, at least in SQL Server, of the reasons we restore something is not to get this database back to the way it was a point in time, but to recover that deleted table or those records that got dropped or whatever. To do that, restoring to a point in time doesn't help me at all. So backups, as far as you see them as a recovery point, they're perfect and they work really, really well. You just go to an Azure restore point, tell it all through the portal, you tell it what date and time you want it restored to, and within a little bit of time, however long it takes, you're done. The trouble is, I can't restore just this or just that. It's an all or nothing proposition. This is one of my main sticking points with Azure SQL Database, the whole backup thing. There are some other things. You cannot run change data capture. So basically, if you're looking at this database as any way to feed a data warehouse, you're going to be severely limited, because CDC, change data capture, is one of the primary ways I use to do my integration, to do my ETL processes. It allows me to understand what has changed since the last load I did. And since I can't run change data capture on an Azure SQL database, it almost eliminates it from being a source of data for your data warehousing. Another limitation of the SQL database, and I'll remind you, I'm talking just about the Azure SQL database, not about an Azure installation in a virtual machine. Another limitation is you can't do cross-database queries. In other words, I can't query from a table in database A and join it to a table in database B. When I'm in that Azure database, I cannot query anything from any other database, whether it's in Azure or on-premise. Now, to counter that, Microsoft is previewing right now something called elastic queries that, with some other limitations, allow you to do some of that cross-database querying. There are quite a few preconditions that you've got to go through to get it done. So they are making that better, but quite frankly, that's a sticking point for some people. And what it boils down to is, if you have multiple databases for an application, this isn't going to be your solution. Another limitation, I know it sounds like I'm just telling you all the negative stuff, but I want you to be sure that I'm not here trying to sell you on anything, so I just wanted you to know the limitations. There are limited extended events. Now, if you're not aware of what I mean by extended events, in the past, we have used a tool called SQL Profiler to measure and record common activity as it happens, so live events. The problem with that was the tool itself caused a decent amount of impact in the performance world. In other words, it slowed down everything. To remedy that, Microsoft came out, actually, I believe it was in SQL 2008, although it didn't gain any traction until really just recently. They introduced something called extended events. And it's a way to accomplish the same goal, to record live activity, and then take a look at it and analyze it, etc. And extended events has way more power than Profiler ever did, and it has next to no performance impact, very little. The trouble is, in an Azure SQL database, you only have certain things that you can measure using extended events. It's not a small list, it's pretty good, but it is limited. I don't know how much anybody uses master data services, or MDS, or data quality services, or DQS. My general experience is few people use MDS, master data, and a medium amount of people use data quality services. But you won't be using, if you're using an Azure SQL database, there's no support for that. There's also no configuration of the server settings, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. As we talked about earlier, you don't have to manage your server. It's taken care of for you. All of that kind of thing. There are some there are some enablements, some things you can set, and we'll look at it. Things like collations and some of those kinds of things. But by and large, the server is hands-off, which is good. It frees you up from having to deal with it. There's also no support for analysis services or reporting services And technically, there is no support for SQL integration services either, although there is a thing called the Azure Data Factory that basically replaces SQL integration services. So when I say it's not supported, that's kind of not really true. It technically is, but all that functionality, or at least most of it, can be handled through the Azure Data Factory, the ADF. So those are the biggest limitations in my thinking of what can and can't be done through a pure database in Azure. How I see an Azure SQL database is an outstanding solution for people who have a more simple need. I don't want to say mom and pops because that's a little bit derogatory, and that's not really true anyway. Fairly extensive environments can be handled through an Azure SQL database. Reduce your need for DBAs, increase your uptime by far, and as we'll talk about in a little bit, drastically reduce your costs. But if you have big, broad enterprise things you need to do, I'm not sure that an Azure SQL database is going to be your solution. As I mentioned earlier, there are managed instances. They're currently in preview, and I'm going to leave you to go investigate those. Think of them as something halfway between a traditional Azure SQL database and an Azure installation through a virtual machine. So those are the limitations. Joseph, have we got any questions I can answer at this point?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. There's one question. Is the SQL database on Azure, can it dedicate access for our site or tenant that is shared with others?
Well, maybe, kind of. You can use, technically the answer is no, but you can get around that by using schemas. And I see a lot of my customers doing something like that. So they would use a schema, dedicate it to a company. So let's say I have company A, company B, and company C that I'm hosting. I could create a company A schema, B schema, and C schema, and keep all the data in there and then restrict permissions at the schema level. So technically the answer is no, but there's a really good workaround for that using schema.
What's a schema?
Great question. A schema is one of those words we use in SQL Server to mean about 10 billion different things. So every time I use the word schema, I feel like I need to define it. But a schema is a way of extending the namespace. So for example, I may have a database. That database obviously sits on a server, or in the case of Azure SQL database, it does sit on the server, but we don't really know anything about it. Within that database, we can have, let's just use the example of tables to store our data. And so we can have these different tables, but if I wanted to have a table named customers, and you wanted to have a table named customers, we'd have a problem. We'd have to call it customer one, customer two, something silly like that. Schema is a way to come in between the database and the table, the object in general, but I'm just using table as an example, to give it another tier of naming space. In SQL Server, we talk about a 4-named space. The names start with the name of the server, dot, the name of the database, dot, the name of the schema, dot, the name of the object. So we have this 4-part name, and the schema is the second part because we count from the right to left because we're wacky, we're SQL people. So the table or the object name would be the first part of the name, the schema would be the second. So as an example, if I had a server called production 1, in there I had a database called CRM. I could have a schema named sales, and I could have a table named customers. I could refer then to that object, that table, as production1.crm.sales.customers. At the same time, in the same database, I could have a customers table in my order processing schema. So it would be production1 dot what did I say, CRM dot ordering dot customers. So a schema gives me an extra namespace. It also gives me a way to control permissions. So I can grant permissions to one schema different than permissions to a different schema. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff. Jeff, there's one follow-up question to the previous question, and that is, how can the data be protected and secured when company A, B, and C are sharing the same tenant database?
They're secured by setting permission sets. So you grant or deny permissions to the schema. Every object in that schema inherits those permissions, and any new objects that are created in that schema also inherit the permissions. Now, of course, you can override that at the object level. So if I have that customers table in my schema, in my sales schema, I could grant all salespeople read permissions to all objects in that schema. But then I've got that one salesperson I don't really trust. I could deny that salesperson permission on a particular table without impacting anything else. So all permissions can be granted or denied or revoked at the schema level. Then your responsibility would be to make sure that your database users don't cross names. So you'd have to create a naming convention for the users that would incorporate, the company A or whatever you wanted to do. And then you just assign permissions appropriately, and it takes care of that for you. Okay, anything else?
No further questions right now, Jeff. Thank you.
All right, great. So those are the significant, at least in my mind, limitations of an Azure-based SQL database. Let's talk about the limitations of an Azure SQL Server installation. There they are. That's all of them. My point is, what I'm trying to get across to you is that if I install a virtual machine in Azure with SQL Server in that virtual machine, and obviously an operating system, and Azure and SQL Server, I have the exact same capabilities as I do if that SQL Server is hosted at a machine on-premise. That Azure SQL Server can be a member of an always-on availability group. We can run SQL integration, analysis, and reporting services against it. We can do all of those typical kinds of things that you would want to do with a SQL instance. There are no limitations. There's no real downside to that. So you can probably guess which my favorite way to go is, but it'll be a decision you'll need to come up with answer for.
Hey, Jeff, one quick question.
Sure.
Is there a distinction between government and non-government customers?
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for you. If you'll send that question to Joseph, I'll do some research and find out. I don't know from a licensing point of view what Microsoft does about that. I do know that I have some customers who are government customers on Azure, and obviously a lot of private customers who are on Azure. But whether there's a distinction between them in anything like licensing or anything else, I just don't honestly know. But if you'll post that up, to email that to Joseph, I'll do some research and find out for you. Great question.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks. Okay. So what's the difference between an on-premise object and an Azure-based object? Well, first of all is the cost. And this is the one that when I talk to people, this is the thing that's on their mind. And I hear my students and people that I talk to in seminars and user groups and things say, you know, I like this idea of Azure, but I don't think we can afford it. And I think they've missed the point. Cloud-based computing, whether it's Azure or Amazon or whatever it is cheaper than on-premise. Every study I've ever read makes that it's not even a debatable point, it's clear. When you take into account the cost of hardware, the cost of licenses, the real estate to rack the server in a data center, the heating, the cooling, the electricity, the repairs, the uptime and down compared to downtime, all of those things, it's not even a close discussion. Hosting your operations is just plain cheaper. You also have quite a bit better, in most cases, availability. Microsoft works on a 99.5% availability rate. And I would say in all my experience, it's much higher than that, but that's their kind of base guarantee. I read a Gartner report, this has been some years ago, but I read a Gartner report that looked at the Fortune 500 companies and analyzed the uptime of their in-house applications, and they averaged in the mid to high 80% range. So having a 99.5% guaranteed uptime is huge. And like I say, in my experience, it's better than that. But that's kind of the base guarantee. So
Hey, Jeff.
yes.
Quick question. Would the SQL Server be a BYOL or is that provided in the build?
You've got the option. You can either bring your own license or you can pay a little bit more for the server and not worry about the license. So it becomes just a monthly fee. So either way is whichever one you've got is the way to go. If you've already got your license, obviously you want to use it. Another thing to think about is performance. I can't make this absolute claim, but I can generalize that the on-server performance will be better in a hosted solution. In other words, what I'm saying is those activities that occur in the CPU, in the memory, on the disk, etc., are going to be faster in Azure than your own machines. Like I say, I can't absolute that because I know some of you guys have just fantastic hardware. And so yours may be better, but in general, the customers I work with see a much better performance on server. The problem is the network, and that's obviously the issue here that's going to affect your performance is, yes, everything runs really fast in the data center at Microsoft, but now it's got to travel the network. And it's going to be impacted by bandwidth, time of day, weather, all that kind of stuff. So anything that you do over the internet is going to have that issue. So you have to factor that in. And I would recommend that you do some samples and do some comparison and find out what your performance is like, because it will be different. Another significant difference is maintenance. You basically don't have any. One of the great joys of my life is that when I'm working with a cloud-based solution, nobody calls me in the middle of the night and says, oh, the power supply died. I don't care. It's not my problem. Microsoft has to deal with that, or whoever my cloud solution provider is. So all of that maintenance of hardware, upgrades, updates, service packs, security patches, all that kind of stuff, I go to bed and it's there for me in the morning. I gotta tell you, I spent a lot of my life with nights being on call and having to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to fix a problem. I love it that I sleep through the night. I sleep like a baby. I don't even think about my databases when I go to bed. Well, okay, that's not entirely true. I do a little bit, but I don't need to. Another big qualifier for this is if you're in the world of big data, everything is so much easier if you're hosting that and keeping everything in an Azure cloud. Just simple. If you're hosting it locally, you can still do all the Hadoop, all the big data, all the lake, all that kind of stuff, but it's got network issues, it's got all that kind of stuff, and it's just way simpler if you keep it up in the cloud. That's my opinion, anyway. I mentioned availability ratings. I didn't mention scalability. I was talking to some guys this morning about transaction log maintenance, and it's always an ongoing discussion amongst DBAs maintaining your T logs. And one of the people said, yeah, but what happens if your transaction log grows so big that you run out of disk space? Well, on-premise, that's ugly. Your server's down. You've got serious problems. In Azure, you go to the portal, click the button that says increase my disk space, and then go to lunch. It's completely scalable. It's the most scalable possible thing there is in the world. So those are some, I don't mean this to sound like a commercial. I want to give you the good and the bad of everything, but those are some of the significant difference between on-premise computing and cloud-based computing.
Hey, Jeff, a couple questions.
Yeah, please.
How would users, if they are in different sites, access to the same Azure database?
Great question, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. So if I can hold off on that, I'll demonstrate doing that very thing.
Perfect. One other question is, will maintenance hours be part per time zone, or is it transparent to any time zone?
It's transparent. All of the maintenance is invisible to you. There is no scheduled downtime. So Perfect. If it has to patch, let's just take an example, a service pack that requires a reboot, kind of everybody's nightmare. What you experience is at one moment you're running on Service Pack 1, and the next thing you know, you're running on Service Pack 2. They handle that in the background by duplicating your environment, patching it, or applying the service pack, whatever, and then rolling you over. And it's basically instant. If there's hardware failure, you've got to understand they have multiple servers in racks. They have multiple racks inside a container, which kind of looks like about like you'd expect a great big old freight train container, a train track, a car is what I'm trying to say. And they have multiple containers within a site. When they need to fail over, they just fail you over to another server in the rack or another rack in the container or even another container. And it's all, you don't, nothing blinks. You don't even see it. So when that disk dies, they're already got that restored somewhere else and ready to go. Good. Other questions?
Yeah. Does scalability come with costs? I'm going to assume yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I don't want to kid you. This is not free by any means. Your first 90 days are, by the way. You can get an Azure Pass to check in and play with it. Just go to MicrosoftAzurePass.com, I believe is the website. I'll check that in a minute. Just MicrosoftAzurePass.com. Get an Azure Pass and you can go in and play. You get the equivalent of, I think it's $100 worth of Azure stuff over the course of 90 days. And you can play with all this. Now, I have to be honest with you, as a Microsoft certified trainer, I get $100 per month forever worth of SQL Azure stuff, well, of any Azure stuff. So that means that I get to play a whole lot more than most people, and that's fun for me. But you can go download a pass and get in for free and play. And then, yes, as you scale up, and we'll see this, more CPUs, more memory, faster disks, etc., it costs the license, or not the, I don't want to say licensing fee, but the fee, the monthly fee for that goes up. It's still going to be cheaper than doing it on-premise, though.
Hey, Jeff, we have a follow-up question regarding maintenance.
Sure. Yeah.
Who's maintaining the Azure database, and what type of access do they have to your database and data?
The Azure, in the case of an Azure SQL database, it depends on what you mean who's maintaining it. Here's what they're doing. They're taking care of all the hardware. They're taking care of all the backups. And I remember we talked about the limitations of those backups. So, do what you want with that. But they're taking care of all the maintenance of backups. They're taking care of all the restore points. They're taking care of all the server configuration, etc. The actual data itself is completely up to you. You have to be the one to cull your data and clean it out and prune it. And you have to make sure you're using some kind of quality control, making sure that all the data is correct and accurate so that you don't have Washington spelled as Washington or whatever. All of that is up to you. They completely hands off your data, but they're handling the hardware and the backups and the network and all that kind of stuff. And do they look at your data? No, they don't.
Who would be the vendor, though? Would it be Microsoft, or would it be an LSP that?
It's Microsoft. Azure is completely Microsoft. So they'd be handling all of that stuff. Now, do they use third-party contractors in their centers? Probably, but it's still a Microsoft responsibility thing.
Thank you. One more question regarding maintenance. Do you need to maintain a SQL Server instance in order to run SSRS reports against an Azure SQL database, or are there options?
No, there aren't. You need to, if you're going to run SQL reporting services, it can read a SQL Azure database, but it can't be on a SQL Azure database, if that makes sense. In other words, I can't install reporting services there. I have to install it on either another cloud-based instance or an on-premise instance. And then, of course, it can read data from the SQL database, but it can't run reporting services there. Good. Any other questions?
Yes, it looks like there's one other last follow-up question to the protection. Is my data protected? Sensitive data not viewed or released to non-authorized persons?
Well, depends on how paranoid you want to get. The quick and easy answer is yes, absolutely. Microsoft guarantees they will not give your data or sell your data to anyone else or let anyone else take a peek at it, etc. On the other hand, if I'm the CIA, I'm probably not putting my super secret Jack Bauer list of CIA operatives in the cloud somewhere. The real answer is your data is sacrosanct. They are not going to mess with your data. But you've got to make the determination. And in fact, there are certain industries and government entities that are legally not allowed to host their data in the cloud. It's a law. And so obviously they're not going to do this. I feel very comfortable and I sleep well at night knowing corporate data is in the cloud. You have to eventually decide who you will and will not trust. And I'm going to leave that. That's your decision. I will just simply tell you that for regularly sensitive data, not Kentucky Fried Chicken secret super spice recipe or whatever, but for normal sensitive data, I feel completely confident leaving it in the cloud. With Microsoft, with Amazon, certainly not just any old vendor, but the trusted ones. Okay, I need to get moving because I really want to demonstrate this all to you. So I'm gonna, if there are other questions, I'm gonna ask you to hold on to them and we can do them at the end. But I don't want to run out of this time without giving you real demonstration. So I'm just gonna fire up here and I'm gonna go to portal.azure.com. I'm gonna log in. And I'm going to first show you how to create an Azure SQL database. So this has become relatively stable. Azure has always been on a rapid release cycle, so there are times when you come in here and look at it and go, wait, where did my such and such a thing go? It's always there, but they've changed the GUI of it. They haven't done that for about 9 months now, nothing significant. So it's relatively stable here. Come in and you look at your dashboard, and as you might guess, you can configure your dashboard any way you want. If you want to create a new resource, you can do several things. You can click on All Resources and then add something, or you can go to the resource itself, like SQL databases, and then create a new one or add it. Just the exact same thing, whatever you like. So I'm going to create a new SQL database. Let's give it a name. Let's call it ABC_webinar. I'm trying to get it so it sorts to the top so I can find it in all the other junk I've got in there. And then there's the idea of a resource group. You can either use an existing one. I have one called JPR resource group, or you could create a new one. Think of this as just a collection of resources. So I'm just going to put them all in the one existing. When I create this database, I can either make it a blank database, in other words, there's nothing in it. I can restore it from a backup, so I would move my backup file, my .bak file, onto a blob space up here, and then create this database, and it will automatically restore the backup into it. Or just to make it simple, I'm going to make a sample database. There's a sample one called AdventureWorks LT. So I'll just have it do that. Now, as I mentioned, your database does have to exist in a server. Even though you don't get to do much with it, there has to be a server. So I'm going to click on this, server, configure required settings. And I could use an existing server if I had one. I don't. So I'm going to create a new server. And since I don't have a server, the blade has already come out here because it knows I don't have one. I have to create one. So let's call this ABC_server. One of the things I'm really not good at is coming up with creative names. And it looks like this, somebody already has that. Oh, I can't put an underscore, that's the problem. So let's call it ABC server. It's already in use, so I'll just append my initials on the end of it. That will probably take care of it. Great. Now I've got to give it a login. So I will make Jeff the administrator, and I'll supply a password. And now notice you can choose your location. United States, West, East, Europe, Central US, Brazil, South, whatever you like. It defaults to whatever is physically closest to you. Okay? And now I've created a server. That's probably about the last time I'll think of that server from now on. Now it's asking me about pricing. So people were asking about pricing. Sorry about that. Let me get that out of the way. And what you do is you choose a DTU, data transaction units. In other words, it's roughly equivalent to the number of transactions per second. And you choose your data size. The more DTUs and the larger the database or larger disk space, the more money it's going to cost you. So this is basic, standard. There's premium. You can come up here and increase up to 4,000 DTUs, and and it's going to give you I'm not going to wait for it. It takes a few minutes, but it estimates the cost per second. Frankly, I've got $100 a month budget. I'm going with the cheapest thing I can possibly find. So 5 transactions per second and 2 gigabytes of data space. Wouldn't be realistic in the real world, but we'll live with it for here. And then I'm basically done. I'm going to create that. That's going to take a minute to run, probably about 2 to 3 minutes. You see the deployment is in progress, and you can always click up here, notifications, and see what's happening. While that's running, rather than sit and wait and look for it, watch the hourglass spin, let's move on. We'll come back to that and show you how to connect to it. But let's go create a virtual machine. So let's go to an Azure instance of SQL Server. So I'll come down here to virtual machines. I've already got one. I'll explain that one in just a second. It's special. I'm going to add a new one to walk you through the process of creating one. You can start with nothing, just a blank, or you can start with any of these things. You can start one with Commvault or Quest, Red Hat or SUSE. You can get a Chef machine. On Cisco, you can do all these things. For us, I'm going to do a SQL Server Enterprise 2017 machine. Right? Basically, it describes over here what that's all about. And I can either save this because I want to look at it later, or I can just go ahead and do it. So I'm going to pull the trigger on this and install or create a virtual machine. It will have Windows, or in this case Linux actually, and SQL Server installed when it's done. So I've got to give this a name. Let's call this Webinar Demo Server, or VM. You can choose whether you want solid state drives or standard drives. Again, it's a matter of money. I have to have a username. This is not a SQL username. This is a Windows login. So once again, I'll do Jeff, and I will create a password. And in this case, the password requirements are a little bit stronger. You have to have, I think it was like 10 characters, has to have an uppercase, lowercase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I see my deployment of my database has succeeded, but let's go ahead and finish this one out. I'll go ahead and use that same resource group. It's the only one I've got. I could create a new one, doesn't really matter. Again, with the location. And someone asked about licensing. If you have a license already, you could just click yes here. And you'd put in your license type and all the information. I don't, so I'll click no. It says save up to 49%. I have no idea how much you really save, to be honest with you. All right, so now that's happening. And it is creating, once again, I've got to choose a size. And here are the prices for these things. This first one looks pretty cheap. I'll just choose a B2S and go with that one. But you can see they get all sorts of expensive if you want them to. You can go crazy. Okay. We can configure high availability, but because I chose a small disk space, it's not enough. So I can't choose high availability, but if I did, I could. Again, with my storage devices, my network, it's going to create a virtual network for me. This will be my subnet. It's going to create a new IP address. The IP address, the subnet, the virtual network, all those things are named objects. So there you'll notice the name of this IP address is webinar demo VM-IP, etc. All right. I can also, and this is an interesting option, I can configure auto shutdown. So if I'm worried about spending too much money, I can configure it to shut down at a particular time, just automatically. It's up to you. Set up monitoring and all of these different things. I'm going to click OK. Now, oops, what was this? Oh, I need to know what ports are going to be accepted. So in my case, I want SQL Server and RDP. I'll explain why later. I think we're good now. Good. Now it wants to know about SQL Server. What's the port? Do you want to do SQL authentication or just Windows authentication? Up to you. If you do Windows authentication, it will just be that account we created earlier. You can set your time for your automatic patching. You can set your backup. It's disabled right now by default, but I could simply enable it and tell it how long it will be retained for. The longer it goes, the more money you're going to pay, whether the backup is encrypted, whether it backs up the system databases, and whether and set your schedule. I'm going to disable the backups because I don't want to bother with it. And that's all there is to it, really. So here's the summary of it. You can always go back until you click the Create button. You haven't done anything. So I'll go ahead and click Create. Now that's going to take about 15 minutes to run, to deploy that virtual machine. That's why I already in advance created a different virtual machine, and I'll show that to you in a minute.
Hey, Jeff, we have a couple of questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right. One is Azure HIPAA compatible?
I don't know. My gut level feeling would be that the answer would be yes and no. And the answer is basically no, that your database could be HIPAA compatible. But the platform on which it runs, I don't know HIPAA well enough to answer this question, but I don't know that HIPAA defines any platform requirements. And if I'm wrong, forgive me, I just don't know. I'm a little out of my depth with HIPAA. But that's certainly something you could ask Microsoft and they'd be able to answer for you.
No worries. Can we answer a couple more? Or I know it's okay. So
I tell you what though, let's do this. Let's answer one more. Then let me complete this demo, and anyone who wants to hang around and see and answer questions, I'll be glad to all day long. But let's answer one more and then finish off the demo. How's that?
Yeah, it sounds perfect. Does Microsoft Security check in anyone from RNC or hacking their cloud and compromising their customer data?
Yes. What they do, I couldn't tell you, and they won't tell you either. But yes, they are completely testing for any kind of attack constantly. Whether or not you think they do a good enough job, that's a decision you'll have to make. I mean, you are entrusting your data to them, and if you don't trust them to protect your data, then don't go with them. I do. I trust them, but that's a decision you'll have to make. But yes, they are very, very proactive about security.
Jeff, I noticed that it's 2 o'clock right now. I know that we're going to go ahead and move on with the demo. Should we, for anyone that has to leave, I know that we've only had an hour. We just want to say thank you for attending, and feel free to email me any more questions you have at joseph.cascasan@quickstart. And we're going to go, I guess we're going to go a little longer than anticipated. Correct, Jeff? And finish the demo and answer some questions.
About 5-6 more minutes on the demo, and then whatever questions we have. If that's
perfect.
I'm sorry if we didn't get this done in time. but I'll be real quick.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, so that database I created initially is ready. And you can come up here to notifications and deployment is successful. And I can pin that to my dashboard. I don't have to, but I'm going to. And now I can click on my dashboard and there is my database. I simply click on it and I can configure this. Now there is a built-in query editor in here. It's clunky and it's slow and it's not very fun, but you can use it. The thing I want to show you is I'm just going to grab, here's the server name. Whatever server you created, it will always end in .database.windows.net. I'm going to simply copy that to the clipboard. Then I'm not in the cloud here. Let me minimize my browser. Nothing up my sleeves here. I'm going to open up SQL Management Studio on my local machine. I'm going to paste in for the server name, that server name, abcserver-jpr.database.windows.net, and I will not authenticate through Windows. I'm going to do SQL Server authentication and use that login and password that I had earlier. This happens to you once in a while. It loses track of whether you're logged into Azure. So you simply click sign in and sign in again to Azure, and then you're fine. Okay, if you remember right, we created this database, this Azure database with the AdventureWorks sample database. And that's where all the tables and everything else comes from. So everything in this database, though the database is called ABC Webinar, all of the data, all of that kind of stuff is coming from that sample AdventureWorks LT database. That's all there is to know about it. Now here's the deal though. This is connecting to a database. If I have two Azure databases, I would have to have a separate connection. I have to connect again, etc. Okay, now let's come back into the portal, go back to my dashboard, and yes, we still have that server that I showed you running and getting deployed. It's not there yet, it's still in progress. But prior to this, I made another one just to show you how to connect to it. So I'm going to click on this. This is my server. Once it's all configured, the question comes, how do I get to it? Well, here's the answer. I click on connect, and it's going to download a desktop session for me, an RDP file, and that's why I chose both SQL ports and RDP ports, 3389 and 1433. So I will simply download that RDP file, and I'm downloading it here. In the real world, I just save it and it'd be on my desktop. Then I click on it. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to sign in with that password. And I can have it remember me if I want to. I'll click OK. And now it's just a remote desktop connection to this server. And look, SQL or Management Studio is already up and running. And I can connect in. Now there's nothing in here. We didn't put any databases in here. But I'm connected. And now I can start creating databases. Et cetera, et cetera. So at this point, everything is a remote desktop session. This copy of Management Studio is running somewhere in the Western United States. I have no idea where it physically is. But that's why I say there are no limitations. Everything is just like you were sitting in front of your machine in the data center, except it's a few thousand miles different. So that's what I wanted to show you. I appreciate your bearing with me and running a few minutes late. I apologize for that. I just need to get going faster, I guess. I need to learn to talk faster, I guess. But that's what I wanted to show you, get you so acquainted with the differences between running a virtual machine in Azure and that virtual machine having SQL Server installed on it, compared to having a database hosted in SQL Server, hosted in Azure. So listen, I know y'all want to run. I appreciate your sticking around. Thank you very much for being here. I'd love to see you again sometime. You know, check out my blog, send me email, come by Expert Connect and connect with me. Take a class, that would be a blast. If you do take a class, tell me that you met me in the webinar. That would be fun to know. And with that, Joseph, I'm going to turn it over to you for questions.
Sure. So Jeff, so do we still have time to answer? It looks like a couple more questions, and then we could.
I've got all day.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so one question it asks is, if I host my SQL database with Azure and I have a web application elsewhere which needs to access the database, how would I do that?
Great question. So if I take a look, let's go back to my database, my Azure SQL database, and you will see right here, there's connection strings. And so you would just simply copy this connection string, copy it to the clipboard, and then go configure your application to use this. And by the way, that's ADO.NET. They've got connection strings for JDBC, ODBC, and PHP. And if that's not enough, I'll show you my super secret favorite website, connectionstrings.com. Has every connection string for everything you've ever even dreamt of, and half the stuff I've never even heard of. Like, I have no idea like what FE Pros is. It sounds like a swear word to me, but all sorts of connection strings there. But the connection strings specifically to your object, your database are right here. Then you just supply your web app with them and you'd be ready to go.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Next question is, will I be charged for SQL Server if I set up a VM and installed SQL Server manually instead of choosing the VM with SQL Server installed?
You'll be charged the same price, whether you install it yourself or you allow their default set installation.
Excellent. Thank you. Can we install only SSIS server and point to a database which is outside Azure?
Yeah, you can actually. You can install SSIS in an Azure virtual machine, not in a database, but an Azure virtual machine, and point it to gather data from anything on the planet. But I'll tell you one thing, before you decide to do that, you might look at the Azure Data Factory. It does most of that stuff, and it might just be all that you need, and it will, that way you don't get charged for a virtual machine.
Gotcha. Next question is, if I enable auto shutdown for my VM, is there an auto turn on?
You know, that's funny. You should ask that, because I had enabled auto shutdown for my machine, and then I forgot the one we just looked at, and I'd forgotten about it about 10 minutes before this webinar. I went to connect to it to check, and it was shut down, and I panicked. I was looking and didn't see anything. All you need to do is go in to the server, and there's a start button. That's all you need to do to start it. But I didn't see anything about auto start. But let me go back and look. So let's see, where is auto shutdown? It's here somewhere. I believe it's here somewhere. There it is. This is how you configure shutdown. I don't see anything. Oddly enough, I don't see any auto turn on. So I guess the answer is probably no. Although that seems like a real lack to me.
Thanks, Jeff.
Sure.
Next question is, can existing Active Directory accounts be exported to Azure VM servers?
Yes, but it's a lot of work. So you've got several options here. Probably the easiest and the best way to go is to create a federated connection between your Active Directory services and Azure's Active Directory services right there. And basically then Azure's Active Directory acts like an LDS, what does LDS stand for? Something domain system. It's a small copy of an Active Directory database. And you can sync those two, and that's probably your best bet. But if you don't want to do that, you can, with an LDAP query, read your current database, or your current Active Directory database, and export it to Azure, if you want to do it that way. But that means it isn't synced automatically. It's a one-time thing.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think we have one last question.
All right.
And that is, can we share your PowerPoint slides to the attendees that attended?
Fine with me, yeah.
Perfect. So,
but yeah, you can have them.
Perfect. So if you want a copy of it, please email me at joseph.cascasan@quickstart. I'm go ahead and type it into the chat box again right now. And if you go ahead and request it, I could go ahead and send you a copy. Everyone, thank you so much for attending, and a really special thank you for Jeff taking the time to do this webinar. I believe, Jeff, would you agree that the best follow-up class for this webinar would be an Azure fundamental course that we offer here at Quickstart?
That would be a great one, because assuming that you already know your SQL stuff, the Azure fundamental class, I don't remember the number of it, but that first Azure fundamental class would be a great one to follow up with.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, and if anybody has questions about it, feel free to email me, and I could send you that information and maybe introduce you to an account rep in your territory that could meet with you, talk to you about all of our Azure and SQL courses. So thank you, everyone, sincerely for attending. Thank you, Jeff, and we'll hope to see you again in our Quick Start classes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for everyone for attending. It was a lot of fun being with you.
Perfect. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.